Alright, so in the previous video we talked about the opponent's arguments basically against the planned economy system. Now let's review the proponent's arguments. Again, this is not to say that a planned economy system is good or bad. We are just reviewing comments made by those who like it and those who don't. Once you have both sides of the picture, it's up to you to make your decision as to if it's good or bad. But for the exam on this course, I will expect you to know arguments of both sides, and you will need to know that stuff in order to get a high grade. So, I bet if I asked you what are the positives of the planned economy, many of you wouldn't even know what to say. I mean, all our lives, or at least your lives, you've been taught that planned economy, communism, or socialism is bad. So what can be good about it? Well, here are a few arguments. One is that a planned economy seems to be a more kind of coherent machine, particularly when you look at, for example, today's China, and even more so when you look at the former Soviet Union. There seem to be some advantages of the system where the government centrally plans and promotes some of the programs. For example, China currently is #1 maker of electric vehicles. China makes many more electric vehicles than, for example, the United States does, and actually many more than the rest of the world combined. They also seem to be doing very well in solar power, in wind power, and again, to a large extent, that's because of that central plan of the government. The government decided that it's something that they want to invest in, and so the whole country works towards that plan. Now, there is a good chance it may turn out to be not a very good plan. Who knows, maybe tomorrow somebody will invent a better technology, or maybe it will be proven that these new alternative energy technologies are not very good. But so far it seems like this is a good plan, and they actually do it better than anybody else, even than the United States. So that government support and that government planning seems to be doing a fairly good job. The same thing when the Soviet Union was destroyed in the Second World War, and they had to rebuild the entire country. All that infrastructure planning was done centrally, and in a matter of a short few years they actually had some of the most developed systems of the roads, of the railways, of the communication lines, and all that stuff. Again, we know that eventually it didn't work out, but at least for that specific purpose that system seemed to work very well. Now, in the capitalist society, we can only hope that the private entrepreneurs will be interested in investing in those systems. But again, will they? How long will it take them? We don't know. Yes, it is true that the United States does extremely well with the private initiative in those areas, but again, the government does intervene often trying to promote certain directions, like all those tax credits for electric vehicles, for example. Good or bad? Well, definitely that's a stimulus for developing that economy or that direction in the economy. So if you believe that alternative energy, green energy is the future, then probably those government incentives are good. And in fact, many Chinese would say that they're not good enough or not enough, right? So the same thing, for example, unemployment. In the free market economy, unemployment is a given. I mean, there will be some unemployment, maybe low, maybe high, but there will be some. In a planned economy, if it's done properly, the plan is not to have any unemployment whatsoever. In fact, in the former Soviet Union, it was illegal to be unemployed. If you were unemployed longer than a certain time, you would actually be arrested and forcefully put to work. It's not to say that you would always get a job of your dreams, but again, being without a job was a criminal offense. While just the fact that everybody is employed does not necessarily make the economy good, even though that may seem to be the case based on today's concern with the unemployment. I mean, you can have people effectively, legally or on paper being employed but not really doing anything, so that's not something I would really, loan for. Also, some people said that the economy should have some unemployment, should have some slack, as they call it, because if a new industry arises, like for example what we seem to be seeing now with electric vehicles, you must have people that are free and able to move into that new developing sector. But again, if you believe that unemployment is inherently bad, well, then you should probably vote for a planned economy, because that system is more likely to ensure no unemployment than any other system. Inflation. Again, there would be no inflation, because if you plan to make a certain number of goods and you plan to sell them at a certain price, there would be no inflation. In fact, the word inflation for the first time was learned by the people living in the former Soviet Union probably around early 90s. In fact, one of my very first conference presentations done in 2000, I mean in 1995 or 6 was on inflation. And the whole presentation I was basically explaining what inflation is. And people were sitting in the audience and were like, whoa, that's cool, that's interesting, all right, okay. So people just didn't know what that was. And was it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know about that, I don't know. But if you feel that rising prices is a problem, then planned economy is for you. It's kind of funny. We grew up in the former Soviet Union knowing how much something cost and knowing that it doesn't cost anything else. Like, for example, sometimes when people from former Soviet Union get together, they would sometimes kind of play this game of, do you remember how much this cost? And so, like, for example, ice cream, 22 cents. The other type of ice cream, 13 cents. A can of tomato juice, 10 cents, or 11 cents if you want it with salt. When I was in Ukraine the last summer, I found my toy chest from the childhood. My parents still have it, and so as I was digging through my toys, I found this wonderful toy that I broke probably 5 or 6 of them growing up. It's a kind of black gun, one of those that, you know, kind of makes fake smoke when you shoot it, and it's black, made of iron, very heavy, and actually looks like a real thing. And so the funny thing about that is that the price on that gun, on that toy, is stamped in steel, so it's basically cast in steel. And the reason for that is because for all my childhood it was 55 cents, and it was a fixed price, and in fact it was so fixed that the actual engraving was made at the factory at the time when the toy was made, and the entire country, in every single store, for many decades, the price was unchanged. And that would be the case with everything else. I even wanted to bring that one as an example for my students, but then I felt the thing looked so real that the airport security would have problem with me, you know, carrying that gun even in my check-in luggage. So good or bad? Well, I don't know about that, but that was one of the advantages that some people seem to believe they are advantages. Economies of scale. Again, as I talked before, in a planned economy, you tend to end up with fewer products, but made on a large scale. And when you make products on a large scale, the cost of production per unit, marginal cost, drops. And so those economies of scale allowed for production of high quality products at a low price. And again, was it good or bad? Well, I don't know. I mean, I kind of seem to prefer a variety without compromising quality. But again, some people say that, and that's true, that in the Soviet Union times, even though there were fewer products to choose from, the ones available were actually fairly good ones. Finally, less economic inequality. If you believe that there should be no poor people, well, you should vote then for a planned economy. In the Soviet Union, again, as I would like to see it, everybody was equally poor, but at the same time there was nobody unreasonably poor. Like, there were no homeless people, there were no people, you know, left behind. Something that you can see in a capitalist society, even including such a rich capitalist society as the United States. Well, in the Soviet Union that was not possible, and again, they didn't have any Bill Gateses, but at the same time they didn't really have any homeless people. And so if you believe that justice means everybody gets his or her fair share and nobody's left behind, well, planned economy may be your way to go. At least that's what the proponents of the system tend to believe. There were also no ups and downs in economic cycles. Like, for example, the economic crisis we're experiencing now. Many people in the last few years have been saying that, well, you know what, maybe some planning is needed. Funny enough, even in the United States, that seems to be the sentiment. Even in the United States, as you know, many people are now saying that maybe we should regulate banking system, or maybe we should regulate the insurance sector. Maybe we should regulate more in general, which is kind of moved toward planned economy. And I'm not sure if they're right or wrong, but, you know, looking at the reasons behind the latest recession, and the pain that it inflicted on many people, and if your parents or you lost job in the last few years, you probably would be more sympathizing with those arguments. Well, if you believe that that was bad, then know that in a planned economy a recession is impossible. You plan and you make a number of products according to the plan, and there would be no layoffs, there would be no downturns in the economic cycle, and overall it would be more stable. Again, would that lead to a better outcome in the long run? Well, it seems like it may work for decades. At least it did work for decades in some countries. But then again, for many people, they believe that it can be done on a large continuous scale, and even though historic evidence shows counterwise, some say, well, look at China. At least so far, the last 20, 30 years, they've been doing very well. In fact, much better than the developed countries, capitalist countries in North America or even those in Europe. So hard to argue with that. Now, from the societal perspective, if you talk about advantages and disadvantages of the planned economy, try to rebuff or refute the argument made by Karl Marx, the father of basically socialism or communism. I'm not a big fan of the guy, and in fact, I had to learn some of his teachings when I was doing my economics degree back in Ukraine, even though at that time the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. But much of the education was still based on that old system, and so Karl Marx was one of the readings that we had to do studying at the college. And one of the arguments, even though I didn't agree with them, with his philosophy in general, one of the arguments was fairly strong. And so the idea was that, or the argument was that in a capitalist, free capitalist society, it is possible that a kid of a poor person will go to bed hungry at the time when just a few blocks away a dog of a rich person will be getting a massage and special spa treatment. And you can probably see that even today, even in the United States, such a rich and developed countries, even here in Greensboro, there would be all kinds of animal spas, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that the money spent on those animals could have been spent on some children that are potentially neglected or not necessarily neglected and not well cared of by their parents because their parents are too poor. And what if one of those kids is the next, I don't know, Einstein, or the next, I don't know, Obama or Reagan, whoever you prefer to like? If that's the case and that kid's parents are poor, the kid may just not have the resources to go to college or even to eat something before he goes to bed to stay healthy. So in a planned economy that would be not possible, and yes, even though the Soviet Union was an evil and bad country, but one thing is certain, that nobody was hungry there. And so again, long term, is it good or bad? I'm kind of leaning towards that it's bad, but again, some people see that as an advantage of the planned economy. And so I'll be curious to hear your arguments against this argument by Karl Marx. And yes, again, note that I wasn't saying that animal spas are bad or that you shouldn't treat your dog well, but at the same time, again, at the societal level, some of the resources definitely may be misdirected toward luxury items or things that rich people may not necessarily need right now at the time when some poor people may be literally dying of hunger or freezing on the street because they don't have a roof above their head, or most importantly, when kids, innocent kids, may not have the resources to have a productive life, and so that's kind of difficult to deal with. Now here is your another next bonus for being in class. Your next question, see if you can answer this one. Now the correct answer to this question is C. Oops. Not C, hold on a second. The correct answer is E. All of the above are true. The question seems to have some logical inconsistency, except all of the above are true, so double negative in a sense. But yes, the correct answer is E, and I'll definitely, if I include this question on the exam, I'll make sure that the wording is more consistent logically. Now, free market economy. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the free market economy? Well, you obviously first know what free market economy is. Free enterprise, free choice, price flexibility. So you basically decide what you do, how you do it, and for how much you sell it. Arguments would be very simple and in a sense counter to what we just discussed with respect to the planned economy. So definitely there is a strong incentive to be entrepreneurial and put effort in your work. No question about that. You work more, you get more. People want to get more, so they work more. Adam Smith's invisible hand. The premise is that in a free market economy, the resources will be miraculously directed towards where they need it most. When there is demand, the supply will follow. And that seems to work fairly well, even though some people argue that it's not quite as simple in reality, but it seems to be working. Everyone can become richer if you work, and so it seems to be the culture that parents teach their children how to be entrepreneurial, and those who do, their children do better. Now, when you look at the correlation between wealth and freedom, there seems to be a strong correlation. Countries that have free economy, free market economy, tend to do better than countries that have planned economy. And while it is true that China is developing faster than the United States today, or that the Soviet Union had its good days, but when you look at the overall wealth as measured, for example, by the GDP per capita, countries with a freer system tend to have a much higher output, so wealthier. Now, interestingly, there are always exceptions, and so when you look at some countries here, you can see economies that are not necessarily very free, but at the same time fairly rich. And so many of them would be, for example, economies of like Middle East, but so some of them are not necessarily very free, and so the political system would be basically monarchy, and there will be some restrictions, but again, the economies are fairly productive. But I guess you can easily see that that's because of the vast availability of natural resources, and so it's not necessarily the consequence of the system, but more the consequence of the basically luck. In terms of opponents, so clearly the advantages of the free market economy are right there. But what would be the negatives? And so again, they would be more or less the other way around from what we discussed as the disadvantages of the planned economy. So from the social perspective, well, it is possible that some resources may be misdirected. Sometimes the focus is too much on making money, and so some people seem to disregard the public good, which is again part of our human nature. I mean, we are trying to do better for ourselves, not necessarily for the society as a whole. And you can definitely do a lot good to yourself, sometimes at the expense of the society as a whole. In a planned economy, that's pretty much impossible because, when you get together, when you plan for that, you try to plan, more fairly, in the good sense. But in a free market economy, sometimes that doesn't happen, and you may have cases when, there are problems with honesty. Like for example, Enron. The story of Enron from the 2000s. I mean, from the 2000s. Unfortunately, in the pursuit of personal wealth, many managers at that company made bad decisions, which hurt not only the people who worked for the company, but also the economy as a whole. The same thing with the environment. Monsanto has a terrible record of polluting environment. And again, my apology for that. So Monsanto has a terrible record of pollution, and so when the question sometimes comes, do I as a company co-owner or manager make an extra $1 million, or do I dump some toxic waste in a river which will increase by 2% the probability of cancer in people living along the river delta? Well, what do? I don't know what you will do, but we know that many of the people at that company made the decision not in favor of the larger group. And again, unfortunately, that happens more often sometimes in the countries with a free economy. At the same time, again, when I look at the former Soviet Union or even today's China, those regions were or are extremely polluted, and so it seems like planned economy is not helping much there, but at least in theory that may be helping better. Also, like promotion of harmful products, like for example junk food, tobacco, energy drinks, all that kind of stuff. Definitely was not the case in the planned economy of the Soviet Union, or now is not the case in the planned economies of, let's say, Cuba or North Korea. Whereas it's definitely very common in free economies, where it seems like sometimes entrepreneurs are willing to sell whatever it takes as long as you're paying money. And I'm sure if there was a restriction removed on selling drugs, like narcotics, on campus, you would have vending machines selling cocaine here under the banner of, freedom of choice. So obviously some regulation, some planning may be good and may be needed in some cases. But again, it's not to say that the planned economy is overall better, just to say that sometimes some features of that system may actually be superior to that of the free market economy. Also, proponents of the planned economy point out that in a free market economy, sometimes it takes a long time from the time a need for a certain product arises till the time that need is satisfied. In fact, studies show that it may be about a year and sometimes longer from the time the need for product arises till the time it's on the market. Because first you have to find financing for building the factory, private or government, but it takes time to find investors. Then it takes time to develop the product, to put it on the market with all the hurdles that the entrepreneurs have to face. It may be a long time. In a planned economy, normally, at least in theory, the process is much faster. The government decided this is what we want to do. The Chinese government decided that we need this super fast train between Beijing and Shanghai, or that we need electric cars, and the whole country starts working in that direction right away. Again, having grown up or being, living in former Soviet Union for some time, I know firsthand that it's only good in theory. I know that unfortunately products there were not delivered faster to the consumers, at least in general, than they are in a free market economy like the United States. But again, on paper, proponents say that it's a better system, and they even cite many examples from the real life, as I said, notably from today's China, where a planned economy seems to be doing better as far as satisfying demand for certain products and speeding up the time of product development and delivery to the consumers. Finally, the opponents of the free market economy point out that a planned economy can also be more effective in redirecting itself in the time of change. For example, again, citing the example of the electrical vehicles and other alternative energy development in China, they seem to be doing much better than everybody else. I mean, the plan of the government is to deliver these products quickly and efficiently, and the whole country is doing it fairly well, whereas the United States and even European countries that are kind of a mix are lagging behind. And yes, it is true that in the United States there are some efforts to catch up with China, and there have been all that money poured into companies like Solandra and some other ones. Didn't quite work, and so some people say here that, see, I mean, we tried and it didn't help when the government intervened. But then again, others point at China and say, well, see, you didn't help enough. If you do it enough, you can actually be the leader in that specific sector. So I'll leave it up to you to decide what needs to be done, but obviously this is an argument that cannot be dismissed just on the grounds of pure stereotypes or ideologies. Now let me give you another example, a very interesting one that illustrates advantages and disadvantages of different systems. This graph here shows how wealth in the world has been distributed, and that distribution has been changing over time. So we have a logarithmic scale here, so $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $100,000. That's the income per year in the country and how it's distributed among its citizens. First, let's take a look at the world. So this is how the world looked like in 1970. So most people on this planet made about $2,000, $3,000 per year. And there were some people who were much poorer than that, and there were some who were substantially poorer than that. And so the distribution was not quite normal, but there was turn. So we basically have a third world countries here, second world countries, and first world countries. This is how it's been changing over time. Actually, it seems like, sorry, my bad. We started from 2000, so I should have. So when we look at the entire world, this is how the world looked like in 1970. Most people made under $1,000 a year, and then there were some countries where distribution of wealth was higher. I mean, people were making higher. And this is how it's been changing over time. So as you can see, the world is becoming richer, the middle class is growing, and nothing really exciting is happening here except for that graph kind of growing bigger and moving to the right. Now let's take a look at, for example, Brazil. So here is what we have in Brazil. In Brazil, which is a free market economy, but also with a very kind of class division, we have this kind of camel type of distribution. So we have lots of people who are very poor, and then we have a few people who are very rich, and there is virtually no one in between. So you're either very rich or very poor. And here is the change over time. So as you can see, the divide is actually getting bigger and bigger. And while the middle class has grown substantially, there is again still this very clear gap between the very rich and the very poor, right? Now when we look at China, a country with a planned economy, this is what they had 40 years ago. The distribution was very normal and very uniform. Most people were in the kind of middle, so there were hardly anyone who was substantially richer, and there was hardly anyone who was substantially poorer. And that was at the time when the economy was planned. Now, obviously, when you look at this graph, you can say that everybody was equally poor, and that's bad, but now see what happens over time. China is becoming rapidly richer, but as it becomes more free, you see this division going on. So it's kind of going toward Brazil is now. So you see this poor class here, but then you see this emergence of the rich class. And so where they may end up over time is may well be this kind of double modal distribution, two-mode distribution, where you'll have lots of very poor people or comparatively poor people, and then some rich people. And so that's one of the arguments that the opponents of the free market system make, this kind of bimodal distribution. Now, when you look at the United States, that's a country with a free economy. Here you see a completely different unexpected trend. The United States obviously is richer than everybody else, and so if you compare it to China, that's where we are. So the United States has a much almost non-overlapping distribution with China. Just about anyone who is very poor in the United States is richer than the richest of the Chinese. But then when you look at the change over time, first of all, you see that China is catching up. And if I switch off China, here is what you see in the United States. Overall, people are fairly rich. There are some people who are much richer. But then you have this class of people left behind. So people who for some reason maybe were born poor and never got out, maybe had a car accident or something and never recovered, never were able to pay that bill. So people who are basically this left behind generation. And so I'm not sure if it's racially determined or something else, but you definitely have this kind of class of people left behind. And so something like that wouldn't be possible in a more socialist society. And so that's what the arguments of the opponents of the free market, or these wild capitalist markets, are. And finally, when you look at, for example, Japan, that has a nice mixed economy, so they have definitely lots of socialism, but then at the same time they have free enterprise. This is where they were 40 years ago, and this is where they are now. So their mixed economy, fairly socialist economy, led to everyone being pretty much equally rich. So if you look at China today, so China is much poorer. They have this bimodal distribution. If you look at China 40 years ago, they had this equality, but everyone was equally poor. But when you compare China to Japan today, in Japan everybody is equally rich, and so there are virtually no poor people, and maybe there are not really rich people, but then at the same time nobody is really poor. So I'll let you decide what's better, best, or what's better, but again, these are some of the arguments here that we dealt with. Now here is a question 3. See if you can answer it. Three, two, one, and stop. And the correct answer is, as in the question before, all of the above are true about the free market economy in terms of what the opponents of that system say in their arguments. Finally, mixed economy. That's what people in Europe have, that's what Canada has. Well, if you look at the historic perspective, actually they do fairly well. They have a steady growth, they have a high quality of life. They have wonderful goals, but at the same time, as I said, they seem to deliver on those goals. Some things, though, don't really work that well. So they have sometimes sectors that are underperforming, especially the ones where the government is in charge. They tend to have higher taxes and higher, lower wages. But then again, at the same time, they seem to like it. And so when you go to Canada or Europe, well, not all of them immigrate into the United States. And the reason for that is because they feel that their system may be better. So the question becomes, if there is a need for government intervention, what would you regulate? I mean, obviously the economy cannot be completely free. Obviously you don't want to, for example, have no regulations on distribution of narcotics. Probably you want to ensure some honest advertisement or advertising. Probably you want to have some form of healthcare system in place where people would have some form of safety net. How about education? Again, would you argue that all education, including elementary education, should be for money? Well, maybe so, but then others would say, well, what if you happen to be born in a poor country, in a poor family? You wouldn't be even able to go to school, so perhaps there must be some form of social programs there. Defense, do you want your army to be completely private, or do you want it to be paid by your taxes and run by the government? These are all tough questions, and obviously again the question becomes, where do you draw that line? So it seems like some sectors need to be regulated, and you probably agree with that. Others maybe need to be left to develop freely, but again, some mix is needed. You probably want to enforce antitrust laws. Again, if it's a completely unregulated market, you may end up with a couple of, my apologies. So to enforce antitrust laws, the government may need to intervene there so that there are no, that the people are not left with a few monopolies. Most also say that the government should intervene when we talk about property rights. Again, that area should be regulated, and probably the taxpayer should pay for that kind of regulation. Fiscal and political stability. Well, obviously, again, you want to have some form of a central bank run by the government. You don't want private companies to be allowed to print money. Finally, and that's most importantly, how do you know which